The official record of World War II has long been presented as a story of good triumphing over evil, of liberation and justice delivered by the Allies against a monstrous regime, yet scattered within declassified archives, behind redacted lines and vanished pages, are fragments that tell another version. These fragments speak not of triumph alone, but of shadows, covert negotiations, secret pacts, erased atrocities, and suppressed complicities. For decades, governments on both sides of the Iron Curtain buried these files, locked them under the seal of national security, and silenced those who asked too many questions. What emerges now is not a comfortable history, but a disturbing one, filled with whispers of betrayal, complicity, and forbidden science. These are not stories meant for textbooks or commemorative speeches, but for classified briefings in dimly lit rooms. They reveal the unsettling truth. Victory and morality were often sacrificed in pursuit of power. These 5 disturbingly forbidden secrets of World War II challenge the very foundation of the official narrative, forcing us to confront what was concealed, what was bargained away, and what was never meant to be remembered. Chapter 1. Classified Pact of Silent Surrender. In the official history books, the collapse of Nazi Germany is portrayed as a clean conclusion. A nation shattered, its leaders captured or dead, and its armies forced into unconditional surrender. Yet behind the curtains of war, something far more unsettling unfolded. In the spring of 1945, long before the rubble of Berlin signaled the Reich's demise, secret back-channel discussions began between representatives of the SS and select Allied intelligence officers. These clandestine exchanges, known under the codename Operation Sunrise, remain one of the most disturbing buried truths of the war. What they reveal is not a story of pure justice, but of calculated bargaining. High-ranking Nazi officials sought to escape annihilation by trading information, assets, and loyalties in exchange for survival, and in certain cases, their pleas did not fall on deaf ears. It was in the neutral city of Bern, Switzerland, that these meetings were first initiated. Bern was a hive of espionage in the final years of the war, crawling with operatives from the Office of Strategic Services, British MI6, Soviet NKVD agents, and double dealers serving whoever paid the most. In March 1945, just weeks before the Third Reich collapsed, SS General Karl Wolff, head of Heinrich Himmler's personal staff, began to negotiate directly with American intelligence officers under Allen Dulles. Wolff had much to offer. He knew the locations of hidden German gold reserves, the positions of retreating SS divisions in Italy, and most importantly, he was willing to orchestrate the surrender of German forces in northern Italy without bloodshed. Officially, the Allies had agreed on a policy of unconditional surrender. President Franklin Roosevelt, Prime Minister Winston Churchill, and Soviet Premier Joseph Stalin had all sworn to one another that no side deals with the enemy would be tolerated. Yet what happened in Bern defied that policy. Dulles, later to become director of the CIA, recognized that Wolff's cooperation could shorten the war in Italy and secure valuable assets before they fell into Soviet hands. Secretly, and without informing Stalin, these discussions moved forward. Documents uncovered decades later reveal that certain Nazi officers were granted immunity from prosecution in exchange for intelligence. Others were quietly absorbed into the machinery of Western intelligence after the war, their pasts sanitized. The Soviets, however, were not blind. Through their own spy networks, Stalin became aware of these negotiations. His fury erupted in telegrams sent directly to Churchill and Roosevelt, accusing them of betraying the Allied cause and colluding with Nazi officers. In Stalin's eyes, Operation Sunrise confirmed his deepest suspicions, that the Western Allies were already maneuvering to block Soviet influence in post-war Europe. The seeds of mistrust that would harden into the Cold War were planted in these shadowy meetings, where American and British officers bartered with men who, only months earlier, had overseen massacres and deportations. The disturbing truth of Operation Sunrise lies not only in the negotiations themselves, but in the aftermath. Karl Wolff, though implicated in war crimes and intimately involved in the deportation of Jews to concentration camps, managed to avoid execution. He served a brief sentence after the war, but escaped the gallows that claimed so many of his comrades at Nuremberg. Other SS officials tied to the Bern talks similarly resurfaced under new identities, their wartime activities scrubbed or minimized in official records. The willingness to shield them was not born of mercy, but of calculation. These men carried with them knowledge of Soviet military movements, the architecture of the Nazi war machine, and the locations of assets that could be repurposed in the coming Cold War. At the heart of this classified pact was a chilling exchange of morality for expedience. Files suggest that American intelligence officers not only ignored the full extent of Wolf's crimes, but actively suppressed documentation that might have led to harsher punishment. Instead, Wolf and others were quietly integrated into a network of ex-Nazi officials who contributed to the shaping of Western intelligence strategy against the Soviet Union. The OSS, which would later evolve into the CIA, recognized the strategic advantage of exploiting these men's knowledge, regardless of the human cost of their past actions. One cannot examine these secret negotiations without acknowledging the broader geopolitical stakes. By March 1945, the Allies knew the war in Europe was already won. The Wehrmacht was collapsing on every front, and Soviet troops were closing in on Berlin. The true struggle was no longer about defeating Hitler. It was about shaping the post-war order. Operation Sunrise must therefore be seen not as an effort to save lives, but as an effort to secure influence. The Americans wanted to ensure that Italy did not fall under Soviet domination, and they wanted to control the flow of intelligence from the collapsing Reich. To achieve that, they were willing to bend the principle of unconditional surrender. Equally disturbing is how long the details of these negotiations remained hidden. For decades, Western governments denied or downplayed Operation Sunrise, framing it as little more than exploratory contact. It was only with the declassification of OSS records in the late 20th century that the true extent of the betrayal became clear. Even then, many documents remain redacted, entire pages blacked out, as if the secrets they contain are still too dangerous to reveal. Historians who have probed the archives describe gaps in the record, missing files, and deliberate obfuscation designed to protect the reputations of those involved. The silence was not only official, but cultural. To present the war as a moral crusade, the Allies could not admit to having made deals with the very men they condemned as monsters. Public acknowledgement of such arrangements would have undermined the carefully constructed narrative of liberation and justice. Instead, Operation Sunrise was buried beneath layers of secrecy, its details whispered only in classified briefings and obscure diplomatic cables. To speak openly of it was to risk exposing the fragility of the post-war moral order. Today, as we piece together these fragments, what emerges is a portrait of wartime leadership willing to compromise principles for power. The Pact of Silent Surrender was not a minor footnote, but a pivotal moment in the transition from World War to Cold War. It illustrates how quickly yesterday's enemies could become today's assets, how swiftly ideals of justice could be subordinated to the demands of strategy. For those who perished in the camps, for those who suffered under SS brutality, the idea that their tormentors were shielded and spared remains one of the most disturbing betrayals in modern history. The record of Operation Sunrise forces us to confront a painful question. How many lives, how many crimes were quietly erased in the name of geopolitical advantage? The answer may never be fully known, for the pact was designed to leave as few traces as possible. What is certain, however, is that the war did not end as cleanly as we are told. In the shadows of Bern, as Europe burned, deals were struck that shaped the world we inherited, and those deals remain etched into the secret history of World War II. Chapter 2: Forbidden Human Experiments in Occupied Europe. Few stories from the Second World War provoke as much horror as the revelations of Nazi and Japanese human experimentation. Yet even this nightmare has layers of secrecy still seldom acknowledged. Beyond the infamous names of Dachau, Auschwitz, and Unit 731, there existed a clandestine exchange of data, knowledge, and personnel that tied together the darkest corners of occupied Europe and East Asia. These experiments were not random acts of cruelty alone. They were deliberate projects with military, scientific, and geopolitical intent, and the most disturbing truth is that their legacy did not end with the Axis defeat. Instead, fragments of their results were quietly absorbed into both American and Soviet research programs, hidden under the codename Black Harvest, and buried in classified archives. In Eastern Europe, German doctors under the SS Ahnenerbe and the Reich Main Security Office orchestrated a series of grotesque trials on prisoners of war and civilians alike. At Dachau, physicians tested high-altitude endurance by locking prisoners inside decompression chambers, pushing them until their lungs ruptured or their brains starved of oxygen. In Ravensbrück, women were deliberately infected with gangrene and then subjected to experimental treatments, many of them crude amputations or untested chemical solutions. Soviet archives released in the 1990s contain fragments of captured German reports, noting results applicable for military field conditions. The chilling phrasing reveals the intent. These were not random cruelties, but controlled experiments designed to extract knowledge useful for the battlefield. Across the continent, in occupied Poland and Ukraine, lesser-known facilities conducted parallel horrors. In Kharkiv, Soviet investigators discovered documentation describing frostbite resistance tests on captured Red Army soldiers. Prisoners were stripped and left in sub-zero temperatures, then revived with heated water, open fires, or even the bodies of fellow captives. Notes recovered by the NKVD in 1944 described the results as inconclusive, yet they were catalogued carefully, suggesting the expectation of further use. Meanwhile, in the Baltic states, secret files mention exposure trials with weaponized chemicals, precursors to modern nerve agents, overseen by SS chemical divisions. On the other side of the globe, the Japanese Army's Unit 731 operated with a similar level of methodical cruelty. Based in Harbin, Manchuria, under General Shiro Ishii, this unit conducted vivisections, frostbite experiments, and biological weapon trials on Chinese civilians, prisoners of war, and even Allied captives. What connects Unit 731 to the European theatre is the emerging evidence of information exchange. Documents intercepted by Soviet forces suggest that by 1943, German and Japanese scientists were sharing results through diplomatic pouches and encrypted cables. The Reich was particularly interested in Japanese work on plague and anthrax weaponization, while Tokyo sought German advances in chemical agents such as tabun and sarin. When the war ended, the expectation was that justice would bring these perpetrators to trial, yet reality unfolded far differently. In the United States, Operation Paperclip was launched to recruit German scientists for American military and aerospace projects. While figures like Werner von Braun are well known, less visible were the medical researchers whose wartime work raised ethical nightmares. Internal US Army reports, marked top secret, reveal that certain findings of Axis human experimentation, while morally objectionable, may prove valuable to ongoing bioweapons and survival. Studies, the codename Black Harvest, was attached to files that compiled results from both Dachau and Unit 731. These were then circulated under strict classification across Fort Detrick in Maryland and other research facilities. The Soviet Union was no less complicit. After seizing German laboratories in Leipzig and elsewhere, Soviet teams transported both equipment and personnel eastward. NKVD documents reference the creation of Special Laboratory 12, a unit dedicated to studying captured data from Axis experiments. Reports mention frostbite survival studies, as well as early attempts at weaponizing diseases for use against potential enemies. Stalin himself reportedly sanctioned the continuation of certain projects, regarding them as vital to the USSR's security against the West. Just as in Washington, the question of morality was buried beneath the demands of power. What is perhaps most disturbing is how carefully these legacies were erased from public view. During the Nuremberg trials, the so-called doctors' trial prosecuted a number of Nazi physicians for crimes against humanity. Yet several names known to Allied intelligence never appeared on the witness stand. Karl Wolff's secret negotiations in Bern were not the only backroom dealings of 1945. In exchange for information, some doctors were spared. Japanese perpetrators fared even better. General Shiro Ishii and most of his senior staff were never tried. Instead, American intelligence granted them immunity in exchange for their research data. Files declassified in the 1990s revealed that Ishii even met with US officials in Tokyo, handing over records of plague and anthrax experiments in exchange for protection. The result is that vast amounts of knowledge derived from human suffering seeped into the post-war scientific establishment. Survival manuals for soldiers exposed to cold or starvation, early research into chemical warfare defenses, and biological weapons programs all carried traces of these forbidden origins. Researchers decades later often had no knowledge of where the data came from, only that it was classified source material. Victims, meanwhile, vanished into statistical charts and coded tables, their names erased. When the Allies and Soviets publicly condemned wartime atrocities, they simultaneously concealed their exploitation of the very same crimes. There are recurring threads in the surviving documentation. References to terminal protocols appear in both US and Soviet reports, a phrase believed to describe procedures where experiments continued until the subject's death. Casual language in the files describes results as useful, applicable, or not viable, with no acknowledgement of the human beings involved. One Soviet archivist, who later defected to the West, described these records as cold, inhuman ledgers of pain, stripped of names and faces. His testimony suggested that even decades later, portions of the archives remained sealed to prevent exposure of how deeply both superpowers relied on Axis findings. The broader implications stretch beyond science. By protecting and integrating these war criminals, Washington and Moscow ensured that full justice would never be delivered. Survivors who testified about their suffering often found their accounts dismissed or minimized, their credibility questioned. Governments feared that acknowledging the truth would raise dangerous questions. How much of modern medicine, survival science, or weapons development was built on a foundation of torture? How could nations justify using the results while condemning the methods? Silence, suppression, and selective memory became the solution. Today, fragments of the Black Harvest files have surfaced, though many remain classified. What they reveal is deeply unsettling. Far from being discarded, the knowledge gained from Dachau chambers and Unit 731 laboratories was catalogued, studied, and in some cases, reapplied. In effect, the victim's suffering was transformed into data, stripped of humanity, and absorbed into the Cold War race for superiority. What should have been remembered as unredeemable evil became, in the eyes of governments, a resource to be mined. The forbidden experiments of occupied Europe and Asia remind us that history is not as clean as we are told. The war did not end with justice fully served. Instead, morality was sacrificed at the altar of strategy. By absorbing the results of these atrocities, both East and West ensured that the legacy of wartime cruelty lived on, not in memory, but in practice. This is the disturbing truth buried beneath the official history, that the suffering of countless nameless victims was never just tragedy, but transaction, their pain converted into power by those who inherited the world after 1945. Chapter 3: Hidden Atomic Conspiracies of 1945. The story of the atomic bomb has long been told as the dramatic climax of World War II. Two bombs, dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, forced Imperial Japan into surrender and ended the bloodshed. But buried beneath this official version lies another narrative, one of secret debates, internal conspiracies, and calculations that extended far beyond Japan. Recently uncovered cables, declassified memos, and Soviet intelligence reports paint a disturbing picture. That the atomic strikes were not only aimed at Tokyo, but were also demonstrations for Joseph Stalin. Behind the mushroom clouds stood a darker agenda, one that blurred the lines between ending a war and beginning a new one. The Manhattan Project itself was an empire of secrecy. Established in 1942 under General Leslie Groves and physicist J. Robert Oppenheimer, it stretched across dozens of facilities in Oak Ridge, Tennessee, Hanford, Washington, and the Desert Laboratory at Los Alamos, New Mexico. Tens of thousands of workers labored in silence, most unaware of the true nature of their task. Yet while the project was shielded from the American public, it was not entirely hidden from foreign eyes. Soviet agents, most famously Klaus Fuchs, but also Theodore Hall and others, slipped secrets of nuclear design directly to Moscow. By the time the United States prepared to test the first bomb, Stalin already knew far more than Washington realized. On July 16, 1945, in the desert of New Mexico, the Trinity test detonated the world's first nuclear device. The blinding flash lit up the Jornada del Muerto basin, and a towering fireball rose above the sands. Officially, this was a scientific milestone. Unofficially, it was the beginning of atomic diplomacy. Within 24 hours, cables flew between Washington, London, and Potsdam, where Allied leaders met to decide the fate of the post-war world. President Harry Truman, newly in office after Roosevelt's death, viewed the bomb not merely as a weapon against Japan, but as leverage in negotiations with Stalin. His diary entries from Potsdam reveal a telling shift in confidence. "We have discovered the most terrible bomb in the history of the world," he wrote, and it may give us the power to dictate terms. The Japanese situation in July 1945 complicates the traditional narrative. Intercepted communications, decrypted under the top-secret magic program, revealed that elements within the Japanese government were seeking a path to surrender through intermediaries in Moscow. They were not demanding total victory, but hoped to secure conditions, particularly the preservation of the emperor. Yet in Washington, these signals were downplayed or dismissed. Declassified memos from the Joint Chiefs of Staff indicate that the bomb's use was seen as inevitable, less for compelling surrender and more for demonstrating American dominance. What is most unsettling are the records suggesting plans for a third, even fourth atomic strike, not against Japan, but as a potential demonstration for the Soviet Union. A draft memo from General Groves to Secretary of War Henry Stimson, partially redacted but later reconstructed by historians, outlined the logistical preparation for a third bomb by late August 1945. While officially this was to be used if Japan continued resistance, intelligence intercepts indicate otherwise. Soviet reports, based on NKVD sources inside Washington, claimed that discussions at the Pentagon envisioned dropping the third bomb on a non-Japanese target, possibly as a warning spectacle. Though the full truth remains shrouded, the implication is chilling. The bomb was already being conceived as a political instrument against an ally. The Soviets did not wait idly. Thanks to espionage channels, Stalin knew of the atomic breakthrough weeks before Truman attempted to surprise him at Potsdam. When Truman hinted at a new weapon of unusual destructive force, Stalin's outward reaction was indifferent, but his orders to his scientists were immediate. Accelerate the Soviet atomic project at all costs. Within days, Lavrenti Beria, head of the NKVD, received direct command to establish a crash program. Facilities at Alzheimer's 16 would become the Soviet counterpart to Los Alamos, staffed not only by Russian physicists, but also by German scientists seized from Berlin. The atomic race had already begun before the second bomb fell on Nagasaki. The decision-making process inside Washington was itself riddled with contradictions. Henry Stimson expressed private doubts, writing in his diary that Japan was already beaten. Admiral William Leahy, Truman's chief of staff, later recalled that he believed the use of this barbarous weapon was of no material assistance in our war against Japan, yet their dissent was silenced beneath the momentum of the project and the political allure of ending the war with a single devastating blow. Official documents framed the bombings as a military necessity. Classified discussions reveal they were also strategic theater, designed to impress upon Stalin the futility of resistance. What remains hidden, even now, is the extent to which the Japanese surrender was already in motion before Hiroshima. Emperor Hirohito himself, though cautious, had begun signaling openness to ending the conflict, provided the throne was preserved. Internal Japanese records recovered after the war confirmed that Foreign Minister Shigenori Togo sought Soviet mediation. Yet Washington's insistence on unconditional surrender and the opportunity to showcase the atomic bomb ensured those channels were ignored. The destruction of two cities became not only an act of war, but a calculated message written in fire across the sky. The cover-up of this atomic conspiracy extended well into the Cold War. Public statements emphasized the necessity of saving lives, projecting the bomb as a tragic but unavoidable decision. Classified histories told another story, one where policymakers weighed not just military factors, but geopolitical signaling. For decades, American leaders resisted declassification of documents that might reveal these motives, fearing they would undercut the moral justification of the strikes. It was only in the late 20th century, as archival restrictions loosened, that fragments of the truth surfaced. Yet even today, significant sections remain redacted, entire pages blacked out with the justification of national security. The implications of these hidden debates are immense. If the atomic strikes were as much about warning Stalin as defeating Japan, then the Cold War did not begin in 1947 with the Truman Doctrine. It began in August 1945, with the blinding light over Hiroshima. The bomb was never merely the end of World War II. It was the opening act of a nuclear standoff that would last half a century. The victims of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, then, were not only casualties of war, but also unwilling participants in the demonstration of a new world order. To confront these conspiracies is to confront uncomfortable truths. The line between military necessity and political intimidation blurred in ways that challenge the narrative taught for generations. The secrecy, the redactions, and the suppressed communications all point to a deeper reality, that the atomic age was born not in triumph, but in duplicity. What was presented as the weapon that ended the war may have been, in reality, the weapon that began a new one. And buried within classified archives, shielded from public eyes, the story of those decisions remains one of the most disturbing secrets of 1945. Chapter 4: Erased Atrocities of Allied Camps. When the war ended in May 1945, the world celebrated liberation. Images of Allied soldiers opening the gates of Buchenwald and Dachau seared themselves into collective memory, symbols of justice and humanity restored. Yet in the shadows of that victory, another story unfolded, one that was carefully concealed beneath layers of silence and selective memory. Newly opened archives and survivor testimonies reveal that the victors themselves committed acts that today would be described as war crimes. These atrocities, committed in Soviet-run camps, in French-controlled zones, and even by American forces, were systematically erased from public history. The result is a haunting contradiction. While the world condemned Nazi brutality, the Allies quietly buried evidence of their own. Perhaps the most infamous of these hidden chapters involves the Rheinwiesenlager, or Rhine Meadow Camps. Established by the US Army in the spring of 1945, these open-air enclosures stretched across Western Germany. Hundreds of thousands of surrendered German soldiers were corralled behind barbed wire, deprived of shelter, and left exposed to the elements. With Germany's infrastructure collapsed, supplies were scarce, but the treatment of prisoners went beyond deprivation. Eyewitness accounts describe men standing ankle-deep in mud, living without proper food or sanitation, many succumbing to disease or starvation. Historian James Back, drawing from declassified US Army records, estimated that tens of thousands, possibly more than 100,000, died in these camps. Official figures reported far fewer, raising disturbing questions about deliberate undercounting. Documents marked restricted reveal quiet orders to downgrade rations and block outside relief efforts, suggesting policy rather than accident. The Soviet Union's conduct was even harsher. Stalin's NKVD established a network of special camps across occupied Eastern Germany and Poland. Here, not only captured Wehrmacht soldiers, but also civilians, teachers, bureaucrats, even children accused of fascist collaboration, were confined. Many of these camps were former concentration camps, including Sachsenhausen and Buchenwald, now repurposed under new masters. Conditions were brutal. Prisoners died from malnutrition, exposure, and execution without trial. Soviet archives later admitted that tens of thousands perished, though exact numbers remain impossible to verify due to missing records. Survivors described forced labor in mines and factories, with the NKVD treating captives as resources to rebuild the Soviet economy. The irony was devastating. Those who survived Nazi oppression often found themselves imprisoned once more, this time by supposed liberators. France, too, was implicated. In its occupation zone, French authorities operated detention facilities where German prisoners were exploited for labor. Reports surfaced of inadequate food, overcrowding, and systematic abuse. Declassified French military correspondence reveals that some camps suffered mortality rates rivaling those in the US zones. Requests for Red Cross inspections were often denied, and evidence suggests intentional concealment of conditions. France, emerging from Nazi occupation, sought both retribution and reconstruction. Its prisoners became a workforce, expendable in the national recovery effort. These atrocities were not limited to the treatment of German captives. Across Central and Eastern Europe, civilians accused of collaboration, or simply caught in the chaos of shifting borders, were subjected to summary justice. In Czechoslovakia, wild expulsions of ethnic Germans led to massacres and forced marches. Entire villages were emptied, with civilians beaten, raped, or killed as they were driven westward. Polish records detail similar acts in territories reclaimed from Germany, where ethnic cleansing was often disguised as official resettlement. These episodes were tolerated, even encouraged, by Allied authorities eager to redraw the map of Europe and erase the remnants of German presence in contested lands. The deliberate erasure of these atrocities is one of the most striking aspects of the story. Official Allied narratives emphasized liberation, reconstruction, and the moral contrast with Nazi barbarism. To acknowledge their own crimes would have undermined this carefully constructed image. Thus, documentation was hidden, mortality figures altered, and survivors' voices silenced. Requests for Red Cross access to the Rheinwiesenlager, for example, were systematically denied on the grounds that the prisoners were not technically prisoners of war, but disarmed enemy forces. This bureaucratic maneuver allowed the Allies to sidestep the Geneva Conventions, stripping the captives of legal protection. By manipulating definitions, they shielded themselves from accountability for decades. These stories circulated only in whispers, carried by survivors whose testimonies were dismissed as exaggeration or propaganda. During the Cold War, both East and West had reasons to suppress the truth. The Soviets framed themselves as liberators, portraying their camps as necessary for denazification. The United States and its allies, meanwhile, promoted the Marshall Plan and the image of benevolent reconstruction. To admit that they had allowed mass suffering in their custody would have jeopardized the moral authority upon which their post-war leadership was built. Thus, archives remained closed, and the victims of Allied camps faded into silence. When documents finally began to surface, they exposed a chilling reality. US Army memos explicitly referred to ration reductions to accelerate demobilization. French correspondents acknowledged the high mortality but framed it as unavoidable. Soviet files revealed systematic cover-ups with orders to falsify camp reports before inspections. Together, these records confirm what survivors had long claimed, that atrocities did not end with Hitler's death. They simply changed hands, carried out in the name of security, vengeance, and political expedience. The moral implications are profound. The victors of 1945 positioned themselves as defenders of justice, yet justice was selectively applied. While Nuremberg put Nazi leaders on trial for crimes against humanity, Allied crimes were quietly buried, excluded from the narrative of righteousness. This double standard shaped the historical record, leaving generations unaware of the suffering endured by those caught on the wrong side of liberation. It also raises haunting questions. Can any war claim pure morality when even its victors committed acts that echo the crimes they condemned? The erased atrocities of Allied camps remind us that history is rarely clear-cut. They force us to confront the uncomfortable truth that liberation and oppression can exist side by side, that victors can be perpetrators, and that memory is shaped as much by what is suppressed as by what is remembered. For the men who perished in the mud of the Rhine meadows, for the civilians who vanished into Soviet special camps, for the thousands used as forced labor in French mines, the war did not end in 1945. Their suffering was written out of history, consigned to silence, until the archives themselves betrayed the carefully constructed myth. And with that revelation comes the sobering realization that victory does not absolve, and that the truth of war is far darker than the stories we are told. Chapter 5. Suppressed Evidence of Vatican Complicity. For decades after the war, the Vatican was celebrated as a moral beacon, a sanctuary in a Europe consumed by destruction. Images of Pope Pius XIII offering prayers for peace reinforced the idea of the Church as a neutral actor, untouched by the corruption of politics. Yet beneath that facade of sanctity lay a hidden network, operating in the shadows of monasteries and church offices, that played a crucial role in the escape of some of the worst war criminals in history. Known as the rat lines, these clandestine escape routes enabled SS officers, collaborators, and fascist leaders to vanish from Europe and reappear in South America under new identities. Recent declassifications of CIA records, Argentine intelligence files, and testimonies from insiders paint a disturbing portrait of Vatican complicity, one that was actively concealed for decades to protect both the Church and Western strategic interests. The mechanics of the rat lines were disturbingly efficient. At their heart was Bishop Alois Hudal, an Austrian cleric stationed in Rome who openly sympathized with Nazism. Hudal exploited his position to provide sanctuary within monasteries, supplying false baptismal certificates and arranging travel papers. The International Red Cross, overwhelmed and often operating on incomplete information, issued identification documents, so-called 10x100 passes, which, when stamped with Vatican seals, gave fugitives legitimacy. Many of these passes bore the names of fabricated refugees but were handed directly to men such as Adolf Eichmann, the architect of the final solution, and Josef Mengele, the notorious angel of death of Auschwitz. Protected by church institutions, they passed unnoticed through Italian ports, Boarding ships bound for Argentina, Paraguay, and Brazil, Argentina under President Juan Perón, became the most significant destination. Declassified Argentine intelligence records reveal close cooperation between Catholic networks and Perón's government, which viewed the arrival of skilled Europeans, including former Nazis, as beneficial to national development. Buenos Aires became a hub for fugitives, with entire enclaves of ex-SS officers living under assumed names. One Argentine official, writing in a now public memorandum, noted that the Church provides the introduction, we provide the passports. Together, they facilitated the survival of men responsible for genocide, mass executions, and medical atrocities. What makes this story most disturbing is not merely the Vatican's involvement, but the deliberate suppression of evidence by Western intelligence agencies. After 1945, the newly formed CIA and Britain's MI6 became aware of the rat lines. Instead of dismantling them, both agencies monitored and, in some cases, exploited them. Former SS officers were seen as valuable assets in the coming struggle against communism. Men with knowledge of Soviet tactics, Eastern European resistance groups, or advanced military technology were quietly recruited, their pasts ignored. Shielding the Church's involvement became part of this larger game of Cold War realpolitik. The calculus was simple. The fight against the USSR outweighed the pursuit of justice. Documents show that American diplomats in Rome were aware as early as 1947 of the Vatican's protection of war criminals, yet official responses were muted. A cable from the US Embassy described Hudal's efforts as unfortunate but beyond our jurisdiction. British records reveal similar restraint, noting the rat lines but avoiding direct confrontation with the Church. The silence was intentional. Both Washington and London feared that exposing Vatican complicity would destabilize Catholic populations in Europe and Latin America, jeopardizing their support against Soviet influence. Justice for the victims of Nazi crimes was sacrificed to the demands of geopolitics. The role of Pope Pius XV himself remains a point of controversy. While no document explicitly links him to the orchestration of the rat lines, circumstantial evidence suggests at least tacit awareness. Reports to the Vatican Secretariat detail the influx of refugees seeking aid, many of whom were in fact Nazi fugitives. Critics argue that Pius's silence, his failure to investigate or intervene, constitutes a form of complicity. Defenders maintain that the Pope was unaware of the full scope, yet the sheer scale of the operations makes ignorance difficult to accept. In either case, the Vatican hierarchy chose discretion over transparency, allowing the network to flourish. The consequences were profound. Adolf Eichmann lived freely in Argentina for over a decade before Israeli Mossad agents captured him in 1960. Josef Mengele evaded justice until his death in Brazil in 1979, protected by sympathizers who had first been introduced through church channels. Countless lesser-known figures, commanders of Einsatzgruppen, Gestapo officers, and collaborators from occupied Europe, escaped trials, their names erased from public memory. Survivors of the Holocaust were left to grapple with the knowledge that their tormentors had not only survived but thrived, aided by institutions that claimed moral authority. The Vatican's complicity extended beyond logistics to ideological justifications. Figures like Hudal framed their actions as acts of Christian mercy, claiming that these men were souls in need of redemption. But beneath the rhetoric lay political calculations. The Church feared the rise of communism in Eastern Europe and viewed former Nazis as potential allies in the fight against atheistic Marxism. This alignment of interests between the Vatican and Western intelligence created a silent pact of protection, ensuring that the rat lines remained operational well into the 1950s. For decades, this story remained hidden, dismissed as rumor or conspiracy. Survivors who spoke of Nazi fugitives in South America were often ignored, their claims attributed to paranoia. It was not until the 1980s and 1990s, with the release of declassified intelligence files, that the scale of the rat lines was confirmed. Even then, many documents remain redacted, entire sections blacked out under the justification of diplomatic sensitivity. The suppression continues, shielding institutions from accountability long after the perpetrators have died. The suppressed evidence of Vatican complicity forces us to reconsider the post-war moral landscape. The institution that presented itself as a beacon of morality became, in practice, a facilitator of escape for mass murderers. Western governments, eager to maintain alliances, chose silence. Justice was not merely delayed, it was deliberately obstructed. The victims of the Holocaust, and the generations that followed, were denied the full reckoning that history owed them. The ratlines remind us that beneath the symbols of sanctity and the rhetoric of liberation, there existed a world of shadows, where morality was bartered away for politics, and where even the most sacred institutions were complicit in suppressing the truth. The 5 disturbingly forbidden secrets of World War II reveal not a clean victory, but a battlefield of shadows where morality was compromised and truth deliberately erased. From secret pacts of surrender to forbidden human experiments, from the atomic conspiracies buried under redaction to atrocities erased from Allied memory, and finally, the Vatican's silent complicity. Each file exposes a system that chose power over justice. The official history we are taught is one of liberation, justice, and moral clarity. Yet the classified archives whisper of another story, one too dangerous for public acknowledgement. These secrets were hidden, not because they lacked evidence, but because they threatened the fragile order built in the aftermath of war. If exposed fully, they would have destabilized governments, shattered faith in institutions, and undermined the very alliances that shaped the modern world. As more files are declassified and more testimonies unearthed, the question remains, how many truths are still locked away in vaults, stamped top secret, waiting to be discovered? And when they surface, will we have the courage to face them? Or will silence once again bury the crimes of history?